11 and welcome to OCR History B Living Under Nazi Rule content videos. This video will focus on theme 3, which is Changing Lives, 1933 to 1939. So within these videos, we're going to have a look at the lives of women, workers, youths and Jews to see how lives changed during the period 1933 to 1939. And we're going to start with policies for women. So just as an overall comment, the Nazis viewed women in a very traditional way. So they were not to wear makeup, they were not to smoke, they were supposed to be in the kitchen providing food for their husbands and their children. They were to wear traditional German clothes, they were to be physically robust for childbirth, so very fit and healthy in order to make as many Aryan children for the Third Reich as possible. So we have two categories really, the Nazi policies and intentions and then the impact that was felt by the women in Nazi Germany. So the first kind of category for policies was marriage and children. So remember, Hitler's aim is that the German Reich would last for 1,000 years. That was what he wanted to happen. And to do that, obviously, he needed as many Aryan children for a next generation to be born. So to encourage this, he set up the marriage loan scheme where Aryan couples were loaned an amount of 1,000 Reichsmarks. The woman had to leave work as part of the loan, and for every child the couple produced, 1/4 of the loan would be removed. So if you had 4 children, you would not have to pay back any of the 1,000 Reichsmark loan. So this was quite attractive to many young Aryan couples, and 250,000 of the loans had been taken by 1934. We also had the Motherhood Cross, which was an award that was given to Aryan mothers who produced lots of children. So a bronze medal was awarded for 4 children, a silver medal was awarded for 6 children, and a gold medal that was presented by Adolf Hitler himself was awarded for 8 children. So again, we can clearly see here that Hitler was trying to encourage Aryan women to have as many children as possible. And divorce is also made easier so that a woman can remarry and have as many children as possible, whether that is with her original husband or with another Aryan man. So the impact then that this had, well, marriages did increase from 516,000 in 1932 to 772,000 in 1939. So this is something the Nazis would have been happy about, and the marriage loan scheme no doubt did encourage that. And births did rise in the early 1930s, but by 1939 the rate had declined. So the marriage loan scheme was arguably more successful perhaps than the Motherhood Cross. Obviously, by 1939, it's worth noting that lots of the German population would have been very aware that war was on the horizon. So that isn't perhaps the best time to start a family. So that might have been in the minds of some of these couples. But nonetheless, the Nazis would have been unhappy with the fact that births were declining by 1939. So the next category of policies is home and work. So the overall aim of the Nazis was to remove women from their jobs and keep them in the home to nurture the family. So just a reminder that we said the marriage loans were only given if the Aryan woman gave up her job, so that reinforces the idea that the Nazis wanted women at home. But restrictions were removed in 1937 due to the need for workers in the build-up to war. So the Nazis had done quite a good job at indoctrinating women to stay at home. So when they then reversed this policy, it doesn't work as well perhaps as they would have liked it to. Hitler never really wanted women to go back to work. He didn't want them making munitions, etc. But that kind of gets ignored by Albert Speer, who needs as much being produced as possible and as many workers on the ground as he can get. So as a result of that, Adolf Hitler's aims really of keeping the women just at home has to start to decrease in its intensity by the time that we get to the outbreak of World War II. So in terms of the impact, the number of women in employment actually increased between 1933 and 1939. In agricultural farming, we go from 4.6 million in 1933 to 4.9 million in 1939. And in industry from 2.7 million in 1933 to 3.3 million in 1939. So we can clearly see an increase. As we've said, World War II, or the approach of World War II, would have had an impact on this. But Hitler would not have been happy with these statistics because he did want women in the home. And finally, we have a policy related to higher education. So the aim, remember, is for women to stay at home. He does not want them in higher education attending university. So female enrolment at university was limited to 10% of all students could be female. So we can clearly see here that he does not want women broadening their horizons with higher education. And in terms of the impact of this, the number of women in higher education fell dramatically. And Hitler didn't have the foresight to realise that this would be a problem in World War II when he needed more specialist workers. So the next category is the impact of Nazi policies on workers. And first of all, we have small craftsmen. So in 1933, we had a law to protect retail trade, which was going to increase taxes on large stores. And the idea here was that the middle classes, the Mittelstand, would be protected. So smaller businesses would be protected by the fact that these large stores were having to pay more tax. However, this had limited impact between 1936 and 1939 as the number of artisans dropped by 100,000. So it wasn't as attractive as the Nazis hoped that it would be for small craftsmen to take up positions of work. We then have peasants, so we had the Reich Entailed Farm Law, 1933, which formed farm owners to pass their land onto the eldest son rather than divide it up or to sell it. This meant that peasants were tied to the land, which limited innovation in farming, and the number of peasants actually dropped from 21% to 18%. So the policies towards small craftsmen and peasants were relatively unsuccessful. So if you had a question on workers in the exam, you could use both of those as examples of unsuccessful policies. We then have industrial workers. So 46% of the population made up industrial workers, so people who worked in factories, for example. And in 1936, the average wage was 35 marks a week. This was 10 times more than dole money. However, the wages had been frozen at 1933 levels and inflation continued to rise. So people were really feeling the pinch and didn't have a great deal of money. There was also something called the Winter Relief Fund, which was essentially a soup kitchen for the worst off. But 3% of all workers' wages were taken forcibly by the SA. So this was supposed to be a charitable donation, but there is no choice in whether you contribute or not. So that would have been, I would imagine, very unpopular with the vast majority of workers. So again, you could utilise that in the exam as a policy that was unsuccessful. This side of the table, I think you're going to remember much more. So we have something that was set up called the Deutsche Arbeitsfront, the DAF, which translates as the German Labour Front. And this was what replaced the trade unions when they were banned in 1933 after the Enabling Act. So we have 29 million members by 1939, and that would be a result of some of these policies. So first of all, Aryan workers would benefit through something called Strength Through Joy. This organised workers' leisure time, it subsidised holidays, theatres and gyms. And in 1937, 1.7 million workers were sent on package holidays around Germany, which would have been extremely popular. Some of these holidays were actually free and the majority cost very, very little. So this gave workers an opportunity to enjoy themselves and would have been extremely popular. We then have the Beauty of Labour scheme. So this aimed to improve working conditions. So it introduced new toilets, changing rooms and showers. It also provided hot meals and improved ventilation. The aim of this was to improve morale and incentivise work. So obviously if you're in comfortable working conditions and you're quite happy at work, the likelihood is that you're going to produce much more and you're going to be much more beneficial to the party if that is the case. So Aryan workers particularly benefited from Strength Through Joy and Beauty of Labour if they were part of the DAF. We then have the Reich Labour Service, also known as the RAD, R-A-D, and the aim of this was to tackle mass unemployment, which remember was at 6 million in 1933 due to the Great Depression. All men aged 18 to 25 had to serve 6 months in the RAD, and they had to build autobahns, railways, bridges. They were not the most popular jobs, so as much as the Reich Labour Service got these men employment, the pay was very low and it was compulsory. So again, if we're thinking about success, it was successful because they had things like the autobahn or the motorway constructed, but most of the men really disliked the Reich Labour Service or the RAD. And finally, we have the Volkswagen scheme, or the VW scheme. So workers could pay 5 marks a week to earn a car. And I'm sure that you remember this one. Remember that the outbreak of World War II meant that production of these cars stopped and nobody actually received a car. There was no refund given. People obviously didn't complain due to the terror organisations that we saw in the previous video in Nazi Germany, such as the SS and the Gestapo. So the Volkswagen scheme really was a failure for workers. So again, think about this evidence in terms of what worked for workers, what was positive, and what didn't work for workers, what was negative, what was unsuccessful for them. So our next category is young people in Nazi Germany, and we're going to start off with how the Nazis controlled teachers. So firstly, any politically unreliable teachers, so any teachers who would not pledge their allegiance to the Nazi party, were sacked in 1933. This really reinforces again this importance of the next generation and Hitler wanting to indoctrinate as many young people as possible. So straight away, as soon as he comes into power, politically unreliable teachers begin to be sacked. Jewish teachers were banned from non-Jewish schools under the Civil Service Act of 1933, so we're already seeing anti-Semitism as well very early on. And the Nazi Teachers League was established, and 97% of teachers had joined by 1939. Now, obviously, this does not necessarily mean that all teachers were pro-Nazi, but what it indicates to us is that there was certainly a level of fear that if you didn't sign up to the Nazi Teachers League, you would lose your position. We also had specialist schools that were established by the Nazis, such as a Napola, which was a military cadet school, which was set up by the SS and the SA. And we also had Adolf Hitler schools, which were run by leaders of the Hitler Youth. And the aim there was to create future leaders for the Nazi Party. Remember again that Hitler wanted the Reich to last for 1,000 years. So he needs the next generation to be trained in military and in leadership. However, neither of these specialist schools were successful. They had no focus on academia, and as a result of that, many parents just did not want to send their children there. So there were only 6,173 students in 16 Napolas and 10 Adolf Hitler schools by 1939. So we can clearly see here that the parents wanted their children in some form of normal education. As much as there still would have been indoctrination throughout it, that is where they wanted their children to go. In terms of the Nazi curriculum, we had old textbooks which were thrown out, and they had to follow lessons that emphasised Nazi ideology, such as Aryan supremacy, Lebensraum, etc. So in maths, for example, maths questions would literally focus on anti-Semitism and anti-disability. So, for example, how much money would have been saved if people with hereditary illnesses were eradicated. Those kind of questions would have formed the basis of maths problems for learners to solve. So this really reinforces the indoctrination that is running throughout the Nazi curriculum in maths. We also had a subject called eugenics, which was race studies, where students would learn about Aryan supremacy, being the Übermensch, the better race, the more significant race, and then the Untermensch, such as the Jews, so the underclass, the inferior people. So that is the kind of thing that would be taught in eugenics, again very clearly indoctrinating the next generation. And finally we had PE, which was made up 15% of boys' timetables. So remember, they wanted the boys to be as fit and as healthy as possible, ready for their military futures. In terms of youth organisations, the Hitler Youth was set up in the late 1920s, and there were sections for boys, girls, juniors and seniors. And it became compulsory to join in 1936, which indicates to us that perhaps membership, voluntarily joining, wasn't going too well. So the fact they make it compulsory indicates the fact that that needed to happen in order for Hitler to be able to indoctrinate as many youths as he wanted to. And it then becomes compulsory to attend the meetings in 1939. And Adolf Hitler shuts down other youth groups, which means that the only way to access any youth facilities is to be part of the Hitler Youth movement. In terms of activities within these groups, then the HJ, or the Hitler Youth, so HJ are the initials for Hitler Youth, you can use those in the exam. Members sang songs, read Nazi books, and they paraded, and they focused on military preparations such as Morse code and use of rifles. The female version was the League of German Maidens, or the BDM, and this focused on domestic duties and childcare, so things like needlework, cookery, as well as the role of practicing to look after children. And it was popular with the working class due to the excursions that the Hitler Youth and the BDM organised. So very, very popular with working class children. However, not all young people were convinced. So by 1939, despite the fact that it was compulsory, we have 82% of German youths who are enrolled in the BDM and the HJ. So we have still quite a significant proportion of parents who are willing to risk being punished essentially for not sending their children to these groups. Young people often became bored by meetings and physical activities because quite often they were run by older Hitler Youth members rather than adults. So in terms of how successful these meetings were, they weren't really, because they weren't being run by professionals. Some parents were clearly worried about indoctrination and denunciation, so perhaps if their child had said something negative about them, would that go to the SD and then to the Gestapo? So some parents would have been too worried to send their children. And then other factors remained important influences on children. So, for example, religion. So we looked in the previous video at the Young Christians, for example, who had 2.5 million members. So not everybody wanted to join, and some people were willing to take the risk of not joining despite the fact that the Hitler Youth was compulsory. The final group for the changing lives from 1933 to 1939 is the lives of the Jewish people in Nazi Germany. So we're going to have a look at the persecution that the Jews faced. Remember, persecuting somebody means ill treatment due to religion, race or ethnicity. So we're going to see the negative treatment that the Jews received up until 1939. So first of all, we have this idea of the Übermensch and the Untermensch. So the Nazis believed that Aryans, the people of Northern and Western Europe, were the strongest, and that word for that is Übermensch. They believed that they could be identified by physical characteristics, and Untermensch included, in comparison, groups such as gypsies, ethnic minorities, Slavic people from Eastern Europe, so for example Poland, and Jewish people. So this is a really central part of the Nazi ideology, the belief that Aryan people are superior, Übermensch, and groups such as the Jews are Untermensch, they are inferior. So that's a key part of Nazi ideology. There were many myths spread about Jewish people, such as Jewish people owned all big business and profited from the economic crisis of the 1920s and 30s with the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression. The idea that the World War I was the Jewish population's fault, and that all Jewish people worked with communists and were left-wing and controlled Germany. So these were the kind of myths that were being bandied about in Germany, and which Joseph Goebbels with his propaganda machine really takes hold of in newspapers such as Der Stürmer. The reality, however, is that Jewish people suffered like everybody else during the economic crisis of the Great Depression. Jewish Germans had fought in World War I for their country, and Jewish people belonged to all political parties. They were not just linked to communism. And it's also worth noting here that despite the Holocaust being the Nazis' most infamous policy, and the fact that Jewish people in Germany actually made up less than 1% of the population, so approximately 500,000 people in Germany were Jewish. So despite the fact that Nazis put all of these policies in place, it was actually such a tiny fraction of the German population that were Jewish. So we're going to start with social exclusion and humiliation. So social exclusion increased during the Nazi rule. So for example, signs that were put up in windows saying things like Jews not wanted here, so Jews wouldn't be allowed to enter shops, for example. Jews were often humiliated by the SA or the police in the street, so public humiliation was very, very common. And publications portrayed Jewish people as money grabbers and communists, so really spreading those Nazi myths with the hope that they would become stereotypes, that German people would see Jewish people and would associate them with these kind of ideas. And as I said, those ideas were published very frequently in Der Stürmer, which was an anti-Semitic newspaper. So in terms of a timeline then of anti-Semitic laws throughout the 1930s, so first of all, in 1933, Jews were excluded from legal positions, and they were excluded from civil service jobs such as teachers. So that is something that happens very early on. 1935, I've put this in a red box, we have the Nuremberg Laws. These are very, very significant. They are a huge turning point for the way that Jews were treated, so please revise this. In 1935, the Nuremberg Laws forbade marriage and sexual relations between Jews and Aryans, or non-Jews, and it strips the Jews of their German citizenship. If you are not a citizen of your country, you are not protected by the law. So this meant from this point onwards that if the Jews faced high levels of persecution, there is nobody that they could go to who would protect them. So the Nuremberg Laws is a huge turning point. Jews are no longer perceived to be German citizens, so they are no longer protected by the law. Forbidding marriage and sexual relations was obviously had the aim of keeping Aryan blood pure and not having any dilution of Aryan blood. So the Nazis wanted to prevent what were known as Mischlings or mixed blood children for the next generation. They do not want them. So as a result of this, the Nuremberg Law aims to get rid of the risk of that. In 1938, we see Jewish children banned from non-Jewish schools. So we have segregation in schools from that point onwards. In 1938 as well, Jews had to have a J stamped on their passports, and they had to add Israel or Sarah to their names. So this is stripping away identity. And also it's worth noting here that the J on the passports was a real kind of aim to not allow Jews to escape to other parts of Europe. Now, the reason for this is because other parts of Europe were also anti-Semitic. It was not just Germany. So having a J on the passport was really limiting and would mean that the majority of Jews had to stay within Germany. We then have another huge turning point, which is on the 9th and 10th of November 1938, we have Kristallnacht. And this was where the SA and local Nazis destroyed 267 synagogues, 7,500 Jewish businesses, and they murdered 91 Jews. The event itself was catastrophic for the Jewish population, and it was a huge turning point. This is the first act of mass violence that we see against the Jews. Nobody steps in to stop this happening, and it really indicates to many Jewish people that things are only going to get worse from here. The SS and the Gestapo sent 30,000 Jews to concentration camps after this event as well. So Kristallnacht is a huge turning point, and many Jews realised they need to leave the country if at all possible, but that was very difficult due to the J on the passports and also due to the fact that they were forced to pay astronomical amounts of money if they were to leave Germany. So many at this point know that things are going to get worse. And of course, this is very, very close now to the outbreak of World War II. So just a year before, so the 9th and 10th of November 1938, a date that you will need to know and an event that you will need to know. And in 1939, finally, Jewish immigrants are not allowed possessions. So they are not allowed to leave the country with any of their possessions. They have to leave them behind. So that timeline of anti-Semitism really shows the gradual progression from kind of being excluded from society to laws being made to physical violence. So those two red boxes in particular, you really do need to know. So I hope that's been helpful for the changing lives of Jews, of women, of workers and of youths. And the next video will be on Germany in war between 1939 and 1945.